Hey everybody, this is Campbell Douglas presenting my sketch on Mikhail Borodin, and in advance I would just ask that everybody forgive mispronunciations on my part, as I'm sure there will be many. But yeah, let's get into it. As an introduction to Mikhail Borodin, I think that D.N. Jacobs provides some insights into how he was perceived internationally due to his portrayal by Western journalists. In the prologue to his book, Borodin, Stalin's Man in China, he says, "To the Shanghai colonials, the filter through which most opinions about China passed to the West, everything in China was comfortably in hand until Borodin and his aides appeared." He then says of the falsehoods and rumors that surrounded the man, "But what could have been more unbelievable than truth? The Chinese Revolution being piloted to victory by a Chicago schoolmaster, born a Jew in the Tsar's Pale, and now in service of international communism." Mikhail Borodin was born in what was then called Yunovichi in modern-day Belarus in a relatively closed-off Jewish community. As a young man, he placed a high value on education, learning to speak Russian fluently and gaining an understanding of Russian literature. This love of education continued throughout the rest of his life. His first real political affiliation was with the General Jewish Labor Bund. What began as an earnestly socialist organization began to focus more on Jewish nationalism and economic concerns. For these and other reasons, Borodin left the Bund and joined Lenin's Bolsheviks in 1903. He proved to be loyal and useful to Lenin, staying with him when his group fell apart in 1904. It is clear that Lenin valued Borodin's youth, resourcefulness, and abilities, as he summoned him to Switzerland during his exile while he was planning his return. Ultimately, Borodin was caught in the Tsar's repression of revolutionary movements and chose foreign exile over exile in Siberia. He was first sent to London and then America due to his activities with immigrant communities in London. He lived in Chicago for about 5 years, starting a relatively successful school to teach Jewish immigrants English, and involving himself to a small extent in American socialist movements. The 1917 revolution prompted Borodin to make the trip back to Russia to claim a place for himself in the Bolshevik movement, ultimately becoming one of Lenin's trusted agents once again. Now that we have some background on Borodin's upbringing, political involvement, and values, I'm going to skip ahead to his role as a Comintern representative in China. Borodin was one of the first Soviet communists to be sent to China after this decision was made that the Soviet Union would put its full support behind Sun Yat-sen. He began work both as a Comintern representative and as an advisor to the Kuomintang. He quickly realized that the organization needed significant changes in order to become a more powerful and effective force in China. One of his chief concerns was that this was a primarily bourgeois party that lacked in peasant and working class participation. One of the major issues with this is that the radical nature of the KMT was in many ways antithetical to the political leanings of the middle class, the class from which much of what would be the officer corps was recruited. In order to combat this, there was an emphasis placed on the education of these men in the ideology for which they would be fighting for at the Whampoa Military Academy, an idea drawn from Soviet experience. By 1924, Borodin was having a fair amount of success, having initiated a reorganization of the KMT as well as the founding of the Whampoa Military Academy. In many ways, Sun Yat-sen was critical to Borodin's success, a fact he clearly recognized. At one point, he pushed for Sun to be elected as the leader of the KMT for life. He often spoke for hours on end, time that Borodin spent doing his best to instill in Sun ideas that reflected the Soviets' priorities in China. The relationship was not without the occasional conflict, but for the most part the time Borodin invested in this relationship paid off. Although it would be overly simplistic to say that Sun's death marked the beginning of the decline of Borodin's influence and power in the KMT, it is a helpful event by which to divide Borodin's time in China. In the time soon after Sun's death, Borodin secured control of the KMT in Canton, among infighting over who would take Sun's place. Widespread strikes that originated in Shanghai sparked anti-imperialist and Western sentiment throughout China. In many ways, this was of great benefit to Borodin's revolutionary goals, pushing more Chinese to an anti-imperialist, pro-union position. In other ways, strikers proved to be a liability, as they were difficult to control and the middle class became more wary and fearful of them. This began to turn the tide of public sentiment against the Canton regime. This distrust and fear ultimately resulted in the assassination of Liu Chengkai, a prominent member of the KMT. The military wing of the KMT grew, partially due to the incorporation of the troops of ousted members of the party. In 1925, it officially became the National Revolutionary Army, which Borodin hoped would help combat some of the increasingly problematic opposition. One of the issues was that the soldiers that made up this army were not the ideologically driven ones that Wampu had produced. Most of the officers and enlisted men were more loyal to money and opium than any revolutionary ideals. Chiang Kai-shek, the man who now shared control of the KMT with Wang Qingwei, Borodin found what might have been his next Sun Yat-sen. Chiang owed his rapid rise in power to Borodin and the Russians, something he admitted publicly. He was of the mind that following Borodin's guidance is what Sun Yat-sen would have wanted. Although it seemed in 1925 that things might have begun to go Borodin's way, there were growing anti-communist sentiments throughout China. Even within the military academy, there was a growing number of cadets who were becoming more right-wing. He was also facing criticism from Moscow, both for moving to create communist revolution too slowly and too quickly. In July of 1926, through various appointments, Chiang secured control of the KMT and by extension the NRA. This marked a distinct shift in power from Borodin's hands to his. Around this time the NRA began the Northern Expedition, a mission undertaken with the purpose of uniting China. In order to cover his rear, Chiang instituted a widespread crackdown on the leftist elements left in Canton. Borodin left Canton with the goal of establishing a leftist regime in Wuhan, a city that was increasingly in economic turmoil. It was becoming more and more clear that Chiang and Borodin would not be able to put their differences aside and work together again. As Chiang grew more right-wing, the relationship continued to decline. This is a picture of Borodin and Wang Qingwei, who continued to be more loyal to the communist cause than Chiang was, as Chiang grew more right-wing. Ultimately, the end of Borodin's mission in China came with the receipt of a message from Stalin that called for a number of impossible things, such as the raising of a CCP army and the establishment of a court to try right-wing officers of the KMT. Borodin quickly recognized this for what it was, which was Stalin protecting himself from future criticism for what he thought would be a failed mission. When Wang got wind of the message, he accused Borodin of being a traitor. The receipt of this news pushed many of the remaining KMT leaders who still had faith in Borodin to side with Chiang. All of this led to a purge of communists from the KMT, and ultimately Borodin fled China after finding his wife, and this was ultimately a failure in the communist mission in China.